So I think in this session, we're not looking necessarily at whether facadism is good or bad. I think we would like to have a discussion about what the issues are when they come up. And they often do come up with the most difficult cases. So most of the projects we'll be looking at will be in San Francisco. Sorry, the slide advanced. Because I think it is most pressing here, but it is something that I think we're seeing across the Bay Area and throughout the state. So I'll start by giving some of the background on where the preservation community has been with facadism, and then we'll have Justin Greving from San Francisco Planning Department. He's a preservation planner there who's been working with the San Francisco Historic Preservation Commission that's been studying the issue about how they would like to respond. And he'll give us a little bit of background and history about the different types of facadisms that there are. And we also have Mike Buhler, who is the executive director of San Francisco Heritage, who is the local preservation organization here in San Francisco. And so he'll talk a little bit about how the organization has been grappling with what actions they would like to take and how to find alternatives. So the slide that we have up there now is part of the question of what do we mean by facadism, and whether these are examples that you think of when you think of facadism. I think in some ways we all think we know it when we see it, but it's a concept that when we were doing this, we realized was not very well defined. And I think there's not even agreement about what term to use. So we often talk about facadism or facadeectomy, which are two common terms, but they tend to have a fairly negative connotation and be used by the critics of this, what people are doing here. Facade retention is another one that is a bit more neutral, but I don't think it's been used quite as much. But whatever we call it, often what we're seeing are two things that's happening. First, there's sort of the loss of most of a building, so that all that remains is one or two walls, maybe three walls. Oftentimes that means that the roofs and floors are all gone as well. And sometimes means a whole section of the building may remain, sort of the first 10 or 20 feet of the building. But much of what made the building a building and a reflection of its time and place is gone. And for many preservationists, this is not an acceptable solution because not only are we losing a historic resource, but it also sends a message that the value of a historic building is only skin deep. But there are others who do find value in saving the exterior facade. Often it's the only thing that people may see and feel that it's worth saving, and it's better than losing everything. And local community members and neighborhood groups sometimes support it to keep some aspect of neighborhood character. This year is an example in Beverly Hills where you can see what the original facade and original building looked like from the 1920s. It took us a while to find photos from the 1990s when they demolished most of the building but kept the front facade. This is at a time when Beverly Hills did not have a preservation ordinance, but they felt like they wanted to keep some aspect of this building. And then how it looks fairly recently up into, I think, 2013 or so, where we looked at it and we weren't quite sure what had happened to the building when we first looked at it, until we realized that all that was left really was the front top portion of this building. And so oftentimes another aspect of why people are looking at facadism is that people feel it provides the city layers and texture, something that's an interesting urban design process, especially at the street level where the public may not even notice the difference. And this is a proposed project in Los Angeles that actually has not been built. I'm not sure if it will be built, but it was for a theater that they're looking to see how it could be reused and was looking at doing housing. And the neighborhood group wanted to see the facade saved at least, if not the whole theater. So that leads to sort of the second part of facadism, which is what gets built behind what remains. And this is the part that tends to be most visible and is what we live with in our streetscape. It's often left to tell the story with little context or understanding of what led to that compromise. And this is Washington, D.C., and I actually don't know the story of this because I was not able to find it. But this is somewhere in D.C., and all that remains with the new building built behind it. So I'll give a little bit of background just on the recent past history of facadism. I feel like the feelings about it has long been mixed and ever-changing. In the 1960s and 70s, I think even the idea of saving any part of a historic building was a radical idea that maybe old buildings have something of value. And so early on, This attitude was coming as part of a response to urban renewal and a lot of changes that was happening, but people started to finally see that maybe there is some value in historic buildings. It was also part of the growing preservation movement in the 1960s with the passage of the National Historic Preservation Act in 1966. But we really see facades emerge in the 1980s as a real estate boom of that period greatly increased development pressures. At the same time, the preservation movement was also gaining momentum, and local commissions and ordinances were just being established. And so they were starting to get a role and be able to negotiate some compromises. But the field was still developing about what was acceptable and what were the best ways to treat historic buildings. So at the start of the 80s, often I think we were just glad to see some part of a historic building saved. These are a couple examples in DC, one in Washington, D.C., where a whole row of street fronts, row houses were saved with a new building built behind it. And then also in Chicago, where this classical building became the base of a new tower. And then into the mid 1980s, as there are more and more examples of this practice, I think in Washington, D.C., Chicago, San Francisco, and many other places, there came a backlash both from the preservation community and from the architecture and planning community. There was this false sense of preservation and Disneyfication of the streetscape and a loss of authenticity that was starting to make facadism seem less attractive. And we started to see some efforts to be more sensitive and to set back the construction, but I think that backlash was starting to gain a lot more momentum. But by the end of the 80s and early 1990s, the trend started to go away as the economic boom ended. But I think at that point, the preservation community was starting to be in agreement that this is not something that we were finding acceptable. In the years that follow, we have more booms, most recently in the mid-2000s. And facadism started to make a comeback with those increased development pressures. But by this time, I think we have more experience in the preservation community. We certainly have more experience using ordinances and finding other alternatives like adaptive reuse and using the federal historic tax credits for rehabilitation, as well as things like transfer and sharing of air rights to be able to protect smaller scale buildings. In California, with CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, we start to see case laws and guidelines about what significant impacts to historic buildings were, so that the loss of integrity through facadism was no better than demolition, and saving a few walls was not enough mitigation to really avoid those impacts. So the examples that we see from this period tend to be much more rare and really for specific cases. We have the Hearst magazine building in New York, which was a long, drawn-out political battle where the base of that building was a historic building that was designated locally, and then I think it was always intended to have a tower on top. Eventually, this was what was built, and yeah, at that point, they were talking about this being a very specialized case and not something that should be a precedent, but I think I certainly have heard from others who point to it and see it as something they would like to see in other buildings, and why can't they do that with their historic buildings? With the Chronicle building here in San Francisco, this one was a case where much of the historic facade had been covered in the mid-century, and it probably was no longer considered a historic resource. And so a developer proposed to build more on that lot and build a larger building. Part of what they proposed was to restore the facade, which in some sense was seen as a partial preservation net gain. But I think these were setting mixed messages to people about whether these were appropriate approaches to preservation. And as we were coming out of the recent recession, the winds have shifted again, and we're back in a period where there's a lot of development pressures. Things seem to be a bit different now. I think what we're seeing now is developers proposing to save facades, not necessarily as a compromise, but as a way to, I think they're trying to avoid controversy or as a way to gain local support. And so they're proposing these out at the outset because they see some value in keeping the exterior. This is a project in Los Angeles where it was the new Pershing Apartments is an affordable housing project that could not reuse the Victorian building for their purpose. It was one of the very few Victorian buildings that remained in Los Angeles. It was not designated, but one that was determined eligible. I think, in a historic district. So part of that was the feeling that I think from the developer side that the facade contributed to the neighborhood that was changing very rapidly, but still had much of the older buildings in downtown Los Angeles. And so they may attempt to set back the new construction so that it didn't overwhelm the original facade and restore the facade. So I think projects like this lead us in an awkward position to decide if we are, as preservationists, supporting facadism or choosing not to support or being silent when they're offered as an option. This is an example in Seattle, which is slightly different, where they have a neighborhood conservation district for areas that are actually determined not to be historic, but where they want to keep the character of the neighborhood. So they're actually offering greater density for projects that maintain the neighborhood character, which in essence incentivizes facadism as sort of the easiest way to maintain that historic character. So often they're keeping the fairly modest facades of these low-rise buildings and gaining additional height along the way. And I think for some people, they feel that this is something they want to see in this neighborhood. These are buildings that would not consider historic, but they're providing some level of continuity for the neighborhood. But often this comes at great expense because it's certainly not cheap to keep just this part of the facade up and to add a new building behind it. But just as there's sort of a wide range of facadisms and building types, there's also a wide range of what our responses to them could be. You know, do we hold the line and say no to all facadism, and even when it's not a historic resource, like in Seattle, or do we stay silent when there's neighborhood support for it, even when it doesn't quite make sense? This is the old spaghetti factory project in Hollywood, which was fairly controversial for many, many reasons. But one of the things was that you can see there what the building looked like before they started the project. It was not considered a historic resource. It had been fairly altered. But the neighborhood group negotiated saving and restoring that building and that part of the facade and incorporate it into the new development. They have many other issues occurring with it, but I think that's something that most of the preservation community stay silent on because there was not a historic resource there to discuss. For landmarks, you know, is this something I think is acceptable? And if the choice is between facadism or losing the resource, is it better to let it go? That's also difficult for us to do, I think. Oftentimes we try to see if we can save as much as possible. Do we try to then design something sensitive or interesting and unique that maybe uses the building or what's left of it as an object that becomes something that we can point to and you can see the differences? I think on the left there is Montgomery Plaza here in San Francisco that many people are probably familiar with here, where two of the bank building facades remain and a tower was built above it in the 1980s. On the right is sort of a rendering of a last-ditch effort to try to save Prentice Hospital in Chicago, which was a modernist building that's sort of lower part of it. I think that a lot of people were drawn to that rendering as maybe one way to try to save it, but on the preservation side, doesn't quite meet our standard, the Secretary of Interior standards, and I think we would try to see, it'd be difficult for us to look at it from a preservation perspective, but there may be some value in that. The project ultimately went forward and the building, I believe, has been demolished. And I think the last thing that seems to be an issue is when we're talking about facadism having an urban design value. For those buildings where there's some character, but they may not be necessarily the best examples of historic buildings, but they contribute to the streetscape. Maybe they're contributors in a potential historic district. Is that something that we can live with? Is there guidelines that we can set for this without it becoming sort of the first go-to option for all historic buildings? This is an example, again, in Washington, D.C., where a number of buildings were saved, or at least parts of them, and something built behind it that fit within the streetscape in some way. So it's not as clear example of facadism when you're on the street. So I'll leave you with those questions and turn it over to Justin, and we can discuss some of this later.
Okay. Thank you, Flora, for that great introduction to the topic today, which is facade retention or facadomy or facadectomy. I'm Justin Greving. I'm a preservation planner with the San Francisco Planning Department. Um, and I just wanted to give a little bit of an outline of what I'm going to be talking about. First of all, sort of why are we talking about facadism or facade retention? Some of the assumptions that revolve around the concept of retaining some portion of a building while allowing for substantial alterations in the remaining section. I'm going to also look at some of the different sort of types of facade retention as we try and decide what it actually means. Um, and then look in some more detail at a few projects specific to San Francisco. So the reason why I got involved with looking at the idea of facade retention was the Historic Preservation Commission, which is the local sort of preservation review body here, was constantly getting the opportunity to review environmental impact reports. And they felt that there was sort of an inadequate exploration of preservation alternatives, either partial or full, in the document of the EIR. So they said, they came out with a sort of a statement describing what they wanted to see in exploring those preservation alternatives. And they sort of toyed with the idea of including facade retention or retaining a portion of the facade as maybe being an acceptable mitigation measure or a partial preservation alternative, but ultimately they kind of couldn't decide. And so they wanted the staff to come back and sort of open up the discussion of facade retention. So I spoke with them twice last year. The first one, largely sort of a reiteration of what I'm presenting today. The second one was looking in more detail at projects within San Francisco. And the last one will be probably coming up in April or May, in an effort to sort of open up their dialogue to say, these are the things that we want you to look at when we talk about what might be a successful partial preservation alternative. So some of the assumptions I think that revolve around facade retention is that it's seen as a compromise between sort of the wills of the developer and that of the preservationists. A lot of times it's kind of understood as stage set example of preservation. And a lot of times I think it's the general populace idea of what preservation means is, let's keep the cute facade and then allow everything behind to be completely different. A lot of times I think there are specific instances when we say exceptional architectural quality trumps any ideas of preservation. I think that Norman Foster edition people see as an, an example of that. And a lot of times the facade retention, there is an opportunity to spend a substantial amount of sort of time and money on the exterior, which a lot of times includes a lot of beautiful architectural ornamentation. So in presenting to the Historic Preservation Commission, I wanted to look at sort of what are the types of facade retention? Like what are we talking about when we talk about facadomy? And one of the first ones, which I think is maybe kind of an early iteration of what we were talking about, was this idea of an architectural folly. So a lot of time the facade detail is this individual standalone element, and it has a lot of rich architectural value or ornamentation. A lot of times just one piece of that building is retained, so it stands as just kind of a synecdoche. And a lot of times it's a monument or an educational tool. So the benefit in retaining this portion of a building would be that it's a remnant that would otherwise be lost, but it becomes meaningless without any interpretation. And I think a good example of that is this arch, which was retained as a result of a large development project in downtown San Francisco. This was once part of this huge produce district, which was kind of the heart of that sort of industrial area of commerce. And the only thing that retained was this one tiny arch. And until understanding kind of the history of the development and the history of the area, I had no idea what it meant. So it's kind of this meaningless bauble that's sitting in this park. Another sort of concept of facade retention is when they like to kind of cobble together a bunch of different architectural facades. And in there, we just look at this sort of two-dimensional element as being an important feature of urban design or urban context. And a lot of times what we're looking at is sort of the rich ornamentation of a mid to late 19th century storefront. Um, and it's, I think, an attempt to create sort of an urban fabric out of a void. So if there's a large redevelopment project, there are instances when they would sort of collect the facades and put them together. So you do get this historic scale of a street wall reconstructed, but I think it becomes what I have called an architectural petting zoo without really any real interpretation. One example of this is in Chicago. This is along Maxwell Street. And as you can see, it's a number of different facades that were all probably from the mid to late 19th century, and then all substantially altered in 1994 when this street wall, which never existed historically, was cobbled together of a range of different facades. And I think they're masking parking garages, office spaces, large retail areas. So there's really kind of no sense of connection between what's been applied on the exterior and what takes place on the interior. But as you can see, they are sort of beautiful buildings with rich architectural ornamentation. One of the types that we in San Francisco struggle with a lot, I think, is where you have a new mass meeting the old form. Um, and the massing is set back in an effort to sort of respond to the existing urban context. And it's an attempt to harmonize it with the surrounding neighborhood. In most instances, however, the larger development is still visible behind the facades. So you get some element of the existing urban fabric retained. Um, but I think this also plays into sort of like what the public understands preservation to be. This is one particularly striking example, also in Chicago. This is the Legacy Tower. It's a 72-story tower tucked behind three facades within a locally designated historic district, which, as you can see, were again these beautiful, probably 4 or 5-story buildings, I think, associated with the jewelry industry in Chicago. And the question of this tower really brings up when we're talking about visibility. So technically, within the confines of this historic district, the tower is not visible. However, what they don't tell you is that they carefully crafted the district boundaries so that it's like in front of the L, it ends at this sidewalk on one street. So yeah, within that confine, you cannot see the 72-story tower. But the second that you cross the street or you get on the L, it's highly visible. Another problem, I think, or sort of typology of facade retention is where you really retain this base and then have this thing kind of popping out above it. And that's really where the development ignores any existing massing and scale of the historic resource. I would say the benefit is sometimes a bold design can take place over a historic building. But the drawback, I would say, is that the historic building just becomes an afterthought to the new construction. This is one that Flora had already mentioned, I think, where they retained just the building base. And part of the argument was that that Hearst had always wanted to build a tower above it. And I would say that some people maybe see this as an excellent Sir Norman Foster design. But I would kind of question whether or not it would be better with the building removed entirely from the base. It doesn't really add anything. And then this is the last one where you have this hollowed out core, which I think is kind of an iteration of this architectural folly. A lot of times this is for a building which has really high artistic or historic value. And there's this sense that any retention of it is worthy, no matter sort of what the end result is. And I think a lot of times is kind of a late response to development pressures. In a lot of instances, the exterior massing remains unchanged, but there is this complete disconnect between what takes place on the interior and what is visible from the exterior. So again, this is another one in Chicago. This was the McGraw-Hill building, and this is this amazing sort of Art Deco building, which had a lot of sculptural elements that were designed by a very famous sculptor. And the exterior itself was designated in 1997. And as a result of a new project, they actually dismantled the entire, probably 4 elevations, stored them off site, and then constructed an entirely new building and kind of hung the skin of the 4 elevations onto a new structure. So from the exterior, if you're not looking very closely, you think there's no change. But if you start to look a little bit more closely, you'll see that they couldn't even manage to line up the floor plates of the new building with the existing fenestration pattern. So you have this sort of really jarring disconnect between what's visible from the exterior and what's taking place on the interior. Again, this is just another example in San Francisco. This was the construction of a 41-story rear addition in 1984, which is just down the street. And in this instance, they actually determined that this sort of jewel box of a bank building was worthy of retention in any sense. And so it's been altered into this interior exterior courtyard that sort of leads into the William Pereira building. From my perspective, I think it actually is kind of a nice public space. I know some people will hate me for saying that, but obviously you lose any sense of that sort of rich interior space, which would have been this beautiful sort of ode to commerce and banking. I just have two more examples of projects that I looked at when I was exploring what was taking place in San Francisco. This is along Polk Street. This was determined not to be a historic resource. So this was probably just at the will of the developer or the architect. They saw this low-story commercial building and said, hey, let's just add 4 stories on top of it. So the pro, I guess, is that you do have this retention of these storefronts along Polk Street, which is kind of a historic neighborhood, which is known for its commerce. I would say the drawback here is that it's pretty poor architectural quality. So you don't have the Sir Norman Foster addition taking place above it. This is another project which is an alteration to an existing parking garage, which was determined just to be a contributor to a National Register historic district. So it's a 2-story garage building with an 8-story addition that is currently, I think, in the process of approvals, or it might already be approved. And the idea was that, well, it's not an individual resource, so the impact of the district is such that even with substantial modification to this one resource, we're not going to lose the entire district. I think there is an attempt to sort of mitigate the new design in terms of maintaining compatibility with the adjacent sort of mid-century modern apartment tower. So I think it somewhat blends into that sort of blank wall a little bit more successfully than some other projects where you do have a very substantial large addition behind a low scale building. And then this last project was another issue that we deal with in the planning department quite often, is sort of de facto demolition. Sorry, the slide didn't come out too well, but this was determined to be eligible California Register Historic District contributor. It's a beautiful sort of stick East Lake townhouse that we see in San Francisco quite often. And we do have demolition calculations in an effort to sort of retain a sense of form for a historic resource, but they don't go into too much detail. So essentially you have demolition of all the interior walls, even the floor plates, while maintaining, in essence, the facade of the building. So now I'll turn it over to Mike Buhler.
Thanks, Flora and Justin, for that great background and numerous examples. My presentation is going to take a slightly different perspective today, the perspective of a citywide advocacy organization and how we grapple with facadism. And you know, our opening slide here is of a project near our offices in Pacific Heights that is now completed. And it's one of the reasons why Heritage has taken an interest more recently again in facadism and is planning to issue a policy paper on the topic, although it's proved to be a very challenging project and it's been delayed. In terms of the framework for my presentation today, I will add some examples of local facadism projects. And I'll also discuss some of the issues that we as a preservation organization confront when we're deciding whether or not to support a project that is a facadism project or is close to a facadism project. and definitions vary, as discussed by Flora and Justin. And then I'll also provide an overview of the policy paper that we have been working on. So from a preservation advocacy perspective, what is wrong with facadism from Heritage's perspective? In our view, we've highlighted, as mentioned earlier, that these projects often create a false sense of history. They're compromise where both the new construction and the historic building loses in translation. And facadism often encourages more facadism. And this is a particular concern in San Francisco today. An issue, of course, that a practice that we thought reached its apex in the 80s is now coming back and is very popular, we're seeing in San Francisco with property values and development pressure. And our overarching concern is that, by going along with these projects, it will only encourage the practice to continue and proliferate. And then really it comes down to authenticity. If you strip the building of everything but its facade, really what is left in terms of its significance? Having listed all of these reasons, it is often a complex set of trade-offs that we consider, and I think it would be foolish to take an absolutist approach on facadism. There are often examples of successful trade-offs being made, and certainly trade-offs that are more beneficial to retain the facade than losing the building altogether. In terms of the heritage policy paper that we've been working on, we had an intern last summer doing research on this, and we have our projects and policy committee of the board working on this now. This is the general framework that we set forth for the paper, providing an overview of varying definitions of facadism over time, and there is multiple gradations, obviously, in which I'm sure you realize. Provide a general history of facadism internationally, how the practice is viewed in Europe and the rest of this country. And also within that section, detail our own views and ambivalence over facadism over time that have not always been consistent. Our hope is to identify design guidelines that have been applied to improve facadism projects and outcomes. We haven't found many useful examples to date. Include case studies of projects that we think are successful or not successful and explain why. And then finally, identify alternatives to facadism that might be more successful than allowing the facadism project to go forward. So I'd like to open with this quote from one of my predecessors at Heritage, Grant DeHart. Jay Turnbull's in the audience here today. He, I'm sure, knew Grant, and this is from an old Heritage newsletter from 1983, where he stated, "There is no greater threat to the architectural preservation movement in this country than the Disneyland philosophy of saving only fragments of older buildings as decoration in the name of historic preservation. Either save and reuse the entire building or let contemporary architecture take its place." So Grant was obviously advocating a more absolutist position regarding facadism. It really struck me that over 30 years ago, this was his greatest concern, and now it's one of mine as well. Having opened with Grant's quote, I thought it would be interesting to look at some excerpts from our positions on various facadism projects that have been covered previously and those that we haven't seen. So 456 Montgomery, these are quotes from our Heritage newsletter from the time back in 1980, which was highly complimentary of this project. And I won't read the entire quote, but the end struck me, such a novel solution was only made possible through the collaboration of an unusually generous client and sensitive designers. So obviously Heritage at that time loved this project and felt it was a great success. And I should say that even our John King, the urban design critic for the Chronicle, often cites this project as an example of a successful facadism project. Jesse Street Substation, which is currently the home of the Contemporary Jewish Museum. This is another project that Heritage endorsed, and I will say people have strongly differing views on whether or not this is in fact a facadism project. I will leave that to you to judge, but what you see in front of you is the original facade, of course, meticulously restored and retained, and the Daniel Liebskin addition built behind it. I underlined a portion of the excerpt from our letter endorsing the project at the time to maybe explain how this project differs from other facadism projects. It is notable that certain interior character defining features were retained as part of the project, although the vast majority of what's behind the facade was demolished. I did want to make another point regarding Jesse Street Substation, and kind of one of the factors that factors into our decision making on these projects is the relative significance of the facade itself. So, for example, in this case, obviously this is a highly significant facade and is probably the most significant aspect of the original building. Other examples that we've seen today are maybe more utilitarian in nature, like auto garages, for example. Are they as worthy of retention as a spectacular facade such as this? Another example of a project over about 10 years ago, which we did not support, 72,000 project. Heritage believes the proposals are out of scale in the area, don't relate to the South End Historic District, and aren't suitable to the scale and appearance of the historic building. And then a more recent example, which Heritage has not weighed in on yet, but I think really highlights the subjectivity of this topic, the inherent subjectivity among our peers as preservation professionals. The Elbow Room is a legacy bar on Valencia Street in the Mission District. It's one of SF Heritage's initial legacy bars and restaurants. It's also previously was home to Amelia's, a lesbian bar that is highly significant social and cultural resource to the LGBTQ community. In 2015, the current owner announced plans to demolish the building, obviously displace the bar, and build new housing on the site. In response to objections raised by the planning department and advocates in the LGBTQ community, since the project was originally announced, an LGBTQ context statement was completed and adopted in San Francisco that made a compelling case for the building's significance and the bar's significance. So in response to that pushback from the department, the design was changed, and a recent rendering is included here on the bottom of the slide to show how the housing will now be set back from the original facade and the new construction built behind it. Now, the quotes I thought were very interesting. This is from an article that came out last week in the Bay Area Reporter, and interviewing, LGBTQ historians and their opinions. Shane Watson, a well-known architectural historian, her view is that it was a preservation success because they were able to save a portion of the building, whereas Gerard at the bottom felt that it was really, excuse me, akin to demolition. And you note that he mentions facadism in very derogatory terms there. Excuse me, get some water. And as I said, Heritage has not weighed in on this project, but one thing that I would be interested in the Q&A, maybe we can discuss this. In the case here, where the primary significance is cultural and social, if the project will result in really destruction of the bar, and there will no longer be a bar in the new project, what is the gain by retaining the facade? Is it a less compelling case to retain the facade when the building's significance is not related to its architecture per se? And then here's a project that we are currently reviewing, which I think the outcome will be very important to the trajectory of facadism in San Francisco. This is the 1500 Mission Street project. It's currently the site of Goodwill. It's located, a Goodwill store is located at Mission and Van Ness in San Francisco. It's been the building has been determined individually eligible for the National Register based on a survey, based on its streamlined modern architecture. The proposed project would redevelop not just the historic building, but the larger site around it as private residential use, as well as the future offices of the Department of City Planning and the Department of Building Inspection here in San Francisco. From our view, the proposed use of the Goodwill site, which is where the office space would go, gives this project heightened symbolic importance, and that is really underscored in our comments on the notice of preparation in 2015. We noted that basically by endorsing facadism for this project, it really undermines the city's ability to curb the practice citywide. In our comments on the NOP, we suggested some specific measures that could be taken to improve the design and retain more of the historic building. And I'll show you how those comments were taken into account. But you can see this is an earlier rendering of the project. It shows the iconic clock tower of the building retained to a depth of 40 feet at the time. And then the new office building stepped up behind it. So here's the revised project, which the EIR comments were just, the comment period just concluded last month. And I wanted to ask you all in the audience, at least those that are in the room today, you know, how this project has changed and how it perhaps has improved since the original rendering of the project. Anybody notice some differences in this project? I don't know if it's that visible.
Oh, and quick reminder, sorry. We should use the mics for any comments so that people online can hear.
It appears that the tower is more freed up. The massing of the addition is stepped further back.
Yes, thank you, Lisa. That's right. That's one of the changes. Anybody notice anything else? Well, since we don't have the microphone, I'll point it out. So another change, and this was a change suggested in our comments, but I'm sure the planning preservation staff also had a significant role in this change, and that is the facade along 11th Street, which is the facade that you see on the right of the slide at the base of the building. That was extended to go much farther back on the site than it was originally. So in terms of the main elevations of the building on Mission Street and 11th Street, there's much greater retention of historic fabric. Now, it's important to note that you know, we felt this project was a difficult one for my board to consider, because obviously good faith efforts had been made to improve the project. And we appreciated that our initial comments were taken into account. In addition, our comments asked for consideration of a full preservation alternative to see if that could meet the project objectives and retain more of the historic building and its eligibility. And the EIR did do that and concluded that the full preservation alternative would in fact meet most of the project objectives. So this is an excerpt from our comments on the draft EIR, which we submitted last month. where we acknowledge the improvements, but still express concern regarding the overall impact of the project. Over 90% of the building would be lost, even with the improvements to the project. And also because of our overarching concern about the symbolic importance of this project. So we endorse the full preservation alternative. I don't know, how that's going to play out. The Historic Preservation Commission also unanimously endorsed the full preservation alternative. So this is an important test case, and we'll eagerly await the outcome. I don't know if Justin's been working on this project. I'd be interested to know. But another example of of Heritage's comments on local policy proposals is the now largely scaled back affordable housing bonus program, which was at the time of our original proposal, our presentation at CPF last year, was pending. Since then, it's been largely revised and scaled back in terms of its impact. But basically, this was a program in response to the affordable housing crisis in San Francisco, proposed basically making it much easier to receive entitlements for housing projects that would build vertical additions in commercial corridors and neighborhoods in San Francisco. That's way oversimplified, but that was the gist of the legislation. And this is an excerpt from the design guidelines that accompanied that proposal at the time. And you can see the example is a Facadism project. So that was very concerning to us. So we pointed out that provisions like this, in effect, incentivized Facadism by encouraging vertical additions on buildings that may not be individually eligible, but are significant context buildings or potential contributors to potential historic districts. So finally, I'll just wrap up with some of the ideas that we've been considering, some of the potential recommendations that will be included in the policy paper when it is issued later this year. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice. So the project on the opening slide, which is the Pine Street project, the Rockwell, our original, that project involved a collection of auto support structures that had been found eligible for the California Register as a potential district. And our comments on that project initially proposed giving the developer flexibility to shift the density around the project site in order to enable the project to retain at least one of the original buildings in the district. Our comments were not adopted, obviously, or followed, but that is the kind of source of this first recommendation, which is to basically allow some flexibility in terms of massing and height for projects that promise to retain the eligibility of the historic building on the site. So maybe allow them to build higher or have less of setback from the lot line, et cetera. So that was one of the recommendations. Also, expand the city's TDR program, which, as we see all around us here in downtown San Francisco, has been largely successful in retaining the historic character of downtown San Francisco. You have some interesting juxtapositions as a result, but such as the Mechanics Library down the street, which is an example of a historic building that transferred its height allotment to the adjacent parcel, which results in a very tall building next to it, yet preserving the historic building. So we feel that that could be expanded to more parts of the city and to give owners of historic buildings less incentive to demolish all but the facade. Again, related to earlier points, incentivize additions instead of facadism, allow perhaps greater density for projects that or an FAR bonus for projects that agree to retain the historic building. And then finally, and this is one that will be the subject of more debate, is especially for buildings that are more modest in terms of their architectural significance, considering the payment of a mitigation penalty in lieu of facade retention. Again, going back to the Pine Street project in my opening slide, just around the corner from that building was a historic church, Trinity Episcopal Church, which is in significant need of restoration and seismic strengthening. And would it have been a better outcome if the facade was not however much was spent on stabilizing and retaining the facade was not spent on that project, but instead invested in a more traditional preservation project that enhanced a designated resource. So those are some of the things we're considering. We definitely don't all have all the answers, and obviously our position has been inconsistent and ambivalent at times, but I look forward to hearing your questions and thoughts on this practice. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll stand here and moderate the questions from the people online. But in the meantime, while I'm looking at this, anybody in the room is welcome to ask questions right now.
Hello, panelists. Thank you. That was really interesting, all three of you. I'm curious just where you draw the line in the definition between a vertical addition and facadism, because it seems like that can be blurry at times. I'm thinking of 690 Market, the Chronicle building in particular, where it was considered a vertical addition and it was set back and the floors were retained. Thanks.
Could you repeat?
So Carolyn's question was about how do you determine the difference between, I think, a facadism versus a large addition. And I think that is one of the questions that we have, and looking at a lot of the examples, there is that fine line where does it look like an addition or does it look like facadism? And I think that's part of our responses as preservationists and as urban planners and architects to that. And maybe is acceptable in some cases if something looks more like an addition. I think that's what Mike was talking about, the idea of allowing greater density for a smaller scale building so that you can keep more of it. But what is that fine line? Is it, do you save 50% of the building and there you still have a historic resource if you can build behind it? It seems like for larger projects where you have the ability to move density around a larger site, you may be able to live with larger buildings next to a smaller building. That looks like an addition, but I think for some of the narrower sites, it becomes very difficult. So I don't know, Mike, as you're thinking of density.
Well, is this on? Okay. Carolyn, you've picked a very great example of I think a difficult facadism project. This is a building that I used to work at the National Trust in the Hearst building right across the street from this project. And for those of you who know the building, the Chronicle building had a 1950s or 1960s facade added over the beautiful brick facade. And this project that is the subject of the question removed that later facade and restored the original. It also gutted out the interior of the building and added this very large scale vertical addition. So that's a perfect example of where there are a complex set of trade-offs. And my personal view on that project is that it's a some benefit, and that restoring that original facade was really adds to the urban fabric tremendously. And it was very controversial at the time. That particular project also, I think, qualified for Mills Act property tax relief. So, but getting back to the question in terms of how you define or where you draw the line, in my research on this topic, I think and I'd be interested in Justin and Flora's thoughts. I mean, that there are no bright line rules, and each project, it seems, has to be considered on its own, taking into account a range of often very important values, whether it be, preservation is just one of those values. Increasingly in San Francisco, affordable housing and density and access to transportation are competing, if not values that take priority among decision makers. So, and also I would argue that the relative significance of the building is also an important factor to take into account. One of Justin's examples with the auto garage that has a pretty tall vertical addition behind it, I see that as a pretty successful outcome, partially because the building itself is not individually eligible, is a contributor to a potential district, I believe, in that case. So anyway, that's my long-winded way of saying I don't know the answer.
I would say the same thing. I think it's kind of a sliding scale between what we would define purely as just a facade retention or a facadism project and what would be considered a substantial addition. I think 178 Townsend Street is kind of an interesting case study. It's a contributor to a locally designated district, and it's I think kind of 1890s amazing low scale brick warehouse that has a 4 or 5 story addition with a pretty substantial setback. I think probably half the width of the depth of the building lot. But as part of that project, they looked into sort of what the character defining features of that building would be, and they actually determined that the first 2 sort of truss framing systems were the only original ones which had the historic timber frame system. So they said, okay, well, that would be kind of an acceptable point to which we would allow for an addition if you were able to retain these structural framing systems that sort of explain this district in terms of its period of significance. So I think a lot of those discussions maybe sort of take place and you don't understand why that addition happens at that area, but there was sort of a concerted effort to understand where would be an acceptable spot for an addition. Obviously that doesn't answer your question, but I think that those are sort of the things that we look into with these projects where it's not kind of a clean addition that's never going to be visible from the street.
Okay, I'm going to take one question from the online folks, and then we'll switch over to the live people. And the first one that came in is which projects, among the projects presented, I don't know if you can go through a run through of a few of them, were determined to meet the Secretary of Interior standards. Maybe just give a few examples from the ones you presented.
The large white addition behind the garage was determined, I think, to meet the Secretary of the Interior standards. The project that I just described on Townsend also met the Secretary of the Interior standards.
Okay.
Those are 2 that I can think of.
I think the Contemporary Jewish Museum probably did as well. I was not here at the time. Somebody in the audience is very familiar with that, I'm sure. And what is the other one I was thinking of?
Well, the Chronicle building, I think, would have to admit them because they do. I
Yes,
think
the
it's a national. Well, it's a Article 11 building, and I think they have a Mills Act. If not they got a federal rehabilitation tax credit.
Okay. Any other questions in the room?
If you're, excuse me, if you're saying they're meeting the Secretary of Interior standards, then who's determining that? Is that at the local level or the federal level? I mean, it seems like CEQA is used so often and the interior standards are mentioned, yet we're getting them applied at a local level, completely different than other jurisdictions.
It would depend on the type of the project. So if it was getting a federal rehabilitation tax credit, it would be reviewed by the state. So it would be reviewed by someone in Sacramento. If it was just a locally designated building, then it would be reviewed by a preservation planner in the planning department as a certified local government.
I think you're right. There is sort of a range of who is doing the review and whether they're consistent jurisdiction to jurisdiction. I think we see at the state level for a tax credit project, tends to be a higher level of adherence to the standards, or they tend to be tougher because they are looking at it more nationwide and statewide than maybe a local jurisdiction where they're looking at it locally and there is more flexibility. But the standards are meant to have flexibility. They are not straight and fast rules. They're guidelines to see how they get applied so that in a lot of these different cases, the local jurisdiction has a wide range of latitude on how they are going to apply them.
I would just add that the vast majority of the examples discussed here, I think the standards would be applied by the planning preservation staff, Justin's colleagues, because most, the practice usually occurs with non-designated buildings in San Francisco, in my observation. I don't know if you'd agree with that. So if it's not designated locally, then the preservation review is handled by the planning staff.
And I think in planning staff, maybe you know this, Justin, when you're looking at it for CEQA, does it have to meet the standards, or is it that it retains eligibility?
I mean, it depends on what the impacts are. If we're analyzing impacts to a historic district, obviously there's more leeway in terms of what could be modified if it's a contributor, if it's a non-contributor. Obviously, we're more concerned if it's individually eligible. I would also add that CEQA, for the large part, does not allow for preservation of interior spaces if they're not publicly accessible, which is not the case when you're doing a federal rehabilitation tax credit. All the interior spaces are subject to the sort of the same level of review. So it really, I mean, it depends on the project.
So to follow up on that remark, there was a question that came in from staff. I'm not sure who it is. Do the CEQA guidelines specifically say that facadism is considered demolition and therefore a significant impact? If facadism isn't considered an acceptable historic preservation practice, what are seen as its benefits other than beautification or aesthetics?
I think for the first part of the question about CEQA guidelines, if I remember correctly, CEQA has a number of, well, it says what the significant impacts are, and one of them is demolition, but the other one is really whether the building still retains eligibility for the California Register. So I think, well, it doesn't address facadism specifically. I think the question is, does the building still have integrity after the project, and would it still be eligible for the California Register? And oftentimes when you lose that much of a historic resource, most likely it doesn't as an individual resource. I'm not sure how that applies for a historic district, when really oftentimes you can lose individual buildings in a historic district and still have a district, but you keep the facade of the building, whether that is considered a significant impact. I don't know if anybody else in the audience has experience with that.
I think that's where the term cumulative impact comes in for a district, right? The more you lose from that district, the more its integrity is damaged.
I think the important point, though, is that you won't automatically have a significant impact under CEQA with a facadism project, especially if the building is just a contributor to a designated district or a potential district. So that kind of limits your test the limits of protection under CEQA. And I'd say, and I'd be interested in Justin's views on this, facadism is most often considered as mitigation to reduce the impact for those types of projects.
I mean, I would add that the Pine Street project that you mentioned is not considered a preservation alternative. That's a full demolition, significant unavoidable impact to those, I think, 2 facades that were retained. So it sort of from a legal standpoint under CEQA, that was a full demolition. Obviously, the public perception of it now is probably that that's a facade retention project, successful or otherwise.
So I thought it was really interesting that you presented the Maxwell Street example, because if I recall correctly, that was sort of the center of the jazz district in Chicago, recognized mainly for its cultural importance. And the big question becomes, once you take away why that district is important, and you leave cookie cutter facades in the front, it still substantially changes the historic character of that neighborhood. So yeah, it was an interesting example. Um, uh, any other, I wanted to be fair with the people in the room if there are any other questions here. Okay, so I'll move on to the next one. And I think we're scheduled to finish up at 1:30, so we still have about 9 minutes. Here's sort of a loaded question. Do mitigation penalties allow developers to buy their way out of facade retention?
I guess I'll take this since I brought it up. And that's why I said it's going to be subject to more and more debate. That is the underlying concern. If you develop a formula that makes it just easy to pay a fine instead of go through the trouble of trying to find ways to retain pieces of a historic building, you obviously run up the risk of making that the the default position for proposed projects. And I would say that in considering this as a potential alternative to facadism, Heritage is looking at it as an alternative for a small subset of projects that involve potential historic resources, focusing on those resources that are not designated, that are not determined to be individually eligible, or derive their significance from being a potential contributor to a potential district, are largely viewed as character buildings and aren't individually distinguished in any way. So in terms of if this becomes a recommendation in our policy paper, it will be very narrowly tailored. And also it would be important, obviously the devil's in the details, and if you develop a formula, I think it would be important to make it so it's not the less costly option to any developer trying to avail themselves of that. So it might save time, but it won't save money. So I acknowledge the concern. I think it's a very legitimate concern, and especially from where I sit as a preservation advocate, I'm very kind of wary of abuse of that alternative if that were available. But it is also important to note that there are interesting examples in the environmental protection sets where mitigation payments are the norm. So I think those examples are going to inform whatever recommendation we make. And I'd be interested to hear what people feel about it here.
This is not related to preservation really, but the city of San Francisco just passed a transportation demand management program, which essentially kind of forces developers to rethink how much parking they want to include in any new addition. And so it's based on a point system. So if you're going to add, 200 parking spaces, you need to have 20 points, and 5 points would include bicycle parking or addition of a shuttle to downtown. And one of the things that they specifically determined was that there was not going to be a way to kind of pay out any sort of in any way getting out of meeting those points. So that was one part where the planning department really determined that sort of having a buyout option was not in our best interest.
And I'll just add one other thing. In considering that potential recommendation, we would also advocate that the beneficiary of that payment would need to be in the immediate vicinity of the project, so the neighborhood benefits from the mitigation payment.
I mean, I think it's an interesting idea. The idea that for buildings where the developers are proposing to save the facade of a building that may not be historic or may not be that interesting, rather than spend the money and the cost on trying to retain something for a short term and put it in to a new project, take that money and provide to other preservation projects in the area that very much need it and have a fund available for that. I think part of what this round of the development pressure has been is that people are proposing keeping the facade as a shortcut. It's not necessarily even a compromise. I think we're just seeing it being outright proposed. And is there a way to discourage that, or to try to convince developers and others that maybe that's not the first step, but maybe rather than do that, they can provide preservation benefits in another way? I'm not sure, Mike, if you've seen other examples of the mitigation funds for preservation? I feel like there may be a few examples out there, but
There are two that we've identified that I don't know if they're good examples or not for San Francisco. One is in Guam, which has a very successful mitigation payment program for projects that impact cultural resources and has created a large fund that goes for authentic cultural preservation projects. The other is in the city of Ontario in Southern California, and we have not been able to find much information available about that. John might know about that program. I don't know. It's probably come up in past CPF sessions. But in the preservation context, there are not many examples. And of course, there are, well, I should note with one, with the exception of one category, there are many examples, including in San Francisco, of mitigation funds, grant funds that have been established with settlement proceeds from CEQA lawsuits. So there's one here in San Francisco for the illegal demolition of a portion of the Emporium building on Market Street that created a $2-point-something million fund that is 10 years later is just now nearly exhausted, but that fund has, and I sit on the committee, has funded historic context statements, landmark nominations, a range of other projects that have done a lot of good for preservation in San Francisco. Another example is at the Long Beach Naval Station in Southern California. There was a lawsuit opposing the demolition of that historic district that created a grant fund that I previously served on when I worked down in LA.
Question over here.
Speaking on behalf of the people across the bay over in Oakland, and Betty, you might be able to better clarify this, but Oakland's been doing historic facades and doing a linear foot calculation based on some number. I don't know if it's been prorated to deal with inflation, but the example that's kind of most absurd is the Oakland Coliseum, where if you can imagine in the future, if they demolish the stadium over there, there's a linear foot amount that will go into actually, I think when it came to the landmark board over there, we tried to get it to go to the neighborhood, but sort of, so they've been doing that, and I think it's been going into a facade improvement fund.
Okay, moving on to another question. This is a three-part question from our online audience. If the role of government is to regulate based on public good, how can cities extend historic preservation protections to interiors of non-public buildings? I'll start with that one.
I mean, I would add that publicly accessible interiors are subject to CEQA, so there is some effort around maintaining a sense of a historic interior space. For example, a lobby of a hotel or a post office. So there are sort of large-scale, successful interior rehabilitation projects. I gave a similar lecture to the Victorian Alliance, and I think essentially what I stated was that it's important to develop public appreciation for the role of buildings and the importance of interior spaces in explaining why we're all here in this preservation field. And I think that they do a good job of getting people out to look inside these Victorian interiors and kind of understand how they functioned historically as spaces. But I think it's kind of an advocacy effort because a lot of those private interior spaces are kind of the first things to go.
I would just add that there's a very inconvenient appellate decision that many of you, I'm forgetting the name, based on a project in San Francisco for a residential interior that categorically holds that CEQA's protection does not extend to private residential interiors. So that is a significant impediment to enacting local ordinances that protect purely residential interiors. I'd say there are opportunities to nibble around the edges, as talked about by Justin, in terms of defining what makes a building publicly accessible. And then also in terms of future designation of those resources, calling out significant interior character defining features as part of the significance. But it's tough in terms of the legal passing muster legally to extend ordinances to residential interiors.
Okay, I think we're about to close up here. So if there are any final questions from the audience, yes.
So I'm wondering about how the historical preservation part of the planning department deals with this. You had talked a few times about how facadism, not necessarily a good thing. Sometimes it gets to the point where you're wondering why the building isn't torn down altogether. There was I think the last few days, last week, there was an example of a Jensen Associates project. So Mark Jensen's office has done work on SF MoMA. So they're fairly respected in the city. They did a project on Alamo Square. It was an existing building, shingles, a Victorian originally. It had been chopped up, had low squat aluminum windows. They showed a picture of it before. And represented a past before urban renewal and an opportunity around Alamo Square to actually have affordable housing. Anyway, but that was taken over by someone. Jensen developed it for them. They showed both the spectacular modern interior, the backyard, where things are a lot looser, there's a lot more variety. And then they showed the front that had been restored to a fairly common looking Victorian building surrounding Alamo Square, which is all Victorians, very consistent historical district, and really losing the opportunity for some great variety that might let the other work stand out, which at a addition scale, a renovation scale, is actually encouraged by the interior standards, that having a difference rather than same old, there might be something to that to bring out the other qualities of the building. So you're talking about Disneylandification that was brought up, and how that would relate to Alamo Square, where we have a serious tourist industry is going on. How it relates to the neighborhood, where you have a community that's changing, whereas preservation is actually not helping to hold on to former values of the community, which maybe economically we're a lot more depressed. So I'm wondering, so you're right, as an architect doing residential work, small scale, the impression is preservation and planning wants facadism. They want us to not touch the front of the house. And as you mentioned, we're allowed to do whatever we want in the backyard. Is there a change at all happening in planning now that facadism isn't encouraged? Or in fact, is it important to hold on to that street face, whereas everything else is happening behind, the city's changing?
I mean, I would say that we have demolition calculations that we apply to buildings that aren't necessarily considered historic resources. And those were created in an effort to maintain existing housing stock. So it's not necessarily about retaining a facade, but it's specific calculations. We have additional demolition calculations that do apply to identified historic resources. In this case, that would apply to the house within Alamo Square. But as Mike Buhler stated, we really don't have jurisdiction on what interior modifications are going to take place from a historic preservation standpoint. The residential design guidelines, which are applied to any residential alteration in the city, look at the general streetscape and the character of the surrounding neighborhood. Again, this is not preservation practice, but this is an attempt to maintain a sense of appropriate scale and massing and sort of detailing for any addition within an existing neighborhood.
Facadism.
I mean, what I'm explaining is what the parameters are that we have to work with when looking at an existing an addition to a historic resource.
I think your example, it's important to note that it is in Alamo Square. It's in a designated local district, and in determining the impacts of that project, the department is appropriately looking on the impact to the integrity of the overall district. So I think in that situation, it is the right decision to retain the facade of a contributor to the district. I'm assuming it was a contributor to the district. You said it was a Victorian home. So as opposed to, I think when you get into the area where you have maybe an older neighborhood that is not designated, has maybe the building has been evaluated as a potential contributor to a potential district, I think there's argument for more flexibility in those contexts. But in the case where you're in a designated historic district, those districts have the highest level of protection in the city. And if you're, a buyer going into that neighborhood, you need to educate yourself in terms of what those protections mean for future developments.
I think it's very interesting. A couple of things you were saying. One, that there's a perception from, as an architect, that preservationists and planners only care about their front facade. That's all for residential. And I think that goes back to our struggle with defining what is facadism. If you're keeping 4 walls on the roof and doing interior alterations, oftentimes that's fairly acceptable in the preservation practice. We adaptively reuse buildings, and people do modify interiors, and the building probably still considered a historic resource in a lot of ways because it is still a building. I think as opposed to some of the examples we were seeing where only 1 wall is left or only 10 feet of the building is left, and something else is added onto. But I think, in some of the examples Justin was talking about, this hollowing out of a building, that gets to be tricky. At what point is it considered a renovation? Is it adaptive reuse? And at what point is it a demolition and facadism?
I want to add one other point on this, and that we haven't really discussed much at length here, is the role of incentives in curbing this practice. In Alamo Square, property owners are eligible for the Mills Act of significant property tax savings. Oftentimes, that is a significant motivator for property owners to retain their entire building. If you are demolishing everything but the facade, you're not going to qualify for Mills Act property tax relief. So I think, educating property owners about the significant incentives we have. San Francisco, just a few years ago, and Heritage worked on this, significantly expanded access to the local Mills Act program, so it's much easier to qualify. And in fact, for the Dubois Park Historic District, which was the most recent district designated in San Francisco, that was a significant factor in turning residents who were staunchly opposed to the district to get them to go along, is that they could qualify for this property tax relief. So I think incentives could play a significant role in minimizing this practice going forward. It's called the Mills Act. It's a state enabling legislation, and basically, without going into the complex formula regarding how it works, if you're a new buyer of a historic property, you can often qualify for a property tax savings of 50% or more. And in San Francisco, that's a significant amount.
And
to add, you also could qualify for the historic rehabilitation tax credit if it's income producing, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think the Mills Act is one place where for local governments, there is the opportunity to look at the interior of a building then, rather than the question about public benefits for the interior. Mills Act is one place where there's some review of the interiors. But I think that goes to the sense that historic preservation and historic buildings is not just necessarily the facade, but there's a character to them, there's a quality to them, the sense of authenticity that the interiors also offer. And at some point you may lose that, but you still have the front of it that contributes to the streetscape and to a district. There's still some value in that. I think a lot of times what we're concerned about with facadism is really where all you have left is a wall or two, and really it becomes an object. It becomes something that's not a building anymore. And we think about what happens what gets built behind it. But it is still very tricky, this idea of where are we when we do a lot of work on the interior. Certainly, I think, especially in historic districts, there isn't necessary review on the inside. But the Mills Act and other incentives, I think all of us in preservation, we hope that people will keep the interiors, that it offers the character of the building, keeps the authenticity for what really is buildings that work for their period and can continue to work. And as we see changes to them, they often are things that 20 or 30 years later are outdated and no longer work. And now you've lost what was part of this really interesting historic building. So I think that's what we're hoping to try to protect. And our role is to make sure the changes are not something that you can't come back from.
Okay, a round of applause for our speakers today. Lisa or Elisa, did you have anything to say from the HRC? Okay, well, thanks for coming, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks for passing that around.
Which one was the two? Well, there's, I mean, when you're looking at a project like that, there are a lot of well, we're supposed to be in the top floor. But I wonder how come it doesn't seem to be back to school. I mean, maybe that's.